And I noticed this about you here with both of these projects, because, you can, in so many ways, look in both things, you can have people that are just not open to life, and they'll meet these people and just think, oh, this is just ridiculous, and dismiss, the whole thing. But you're not. You're slowing down. You're being mindful. You're paying attention to people that probably you're one of the few people that has ever probably taken any interest in them, and in them and what they're interested in and what they do and so on. And I just can't help but find a sense of compassion that you're finding here.
There's potential in almost every experience, right? So you have to be open in order to have any experiences. If you're just like, I'm looking for this and this only, you're never going to see anything or find anything, right? Like my students, so many times I'm like, all right, what do you think of this? And they're like, I don't like this. I'm not looking at this. I'm not going to do this. And I'm like, listen, if you're an artist, to me, that means being receptive to all things, right? But you can't tell someone like, you should like this because you should just like it. But I do think, you have to be open to make anything, right? Like,
yeah, gosh, well, there you go. Put that on a t-shirt. Yeah, like that is great. Welcome to the show, Terry.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
Glad to have you. I've been diving into your work a little bit, and I'm excited to kind of have a deep dive into your world, which is quite fascinating. And what's great about Urbanautica is that I get to meet all these great photographers. And I was reading your interview, and you had a lot in there that I just was like, I want to talk to you more about. But before we get started, let's go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience. So for those that don't know you, go ahead and tell us who you are.
I'm Terry Ratzlaff. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I teach at a little university here called Nebraska Wesleyan University. I like to make photos of trains, time, world making, things like that.
A lot of times I like to figure out a little bit about, a little bit more about where you came from. And so were you always into art, were in cameras? Talk to me a little bit about who you were before you were an artist and a photographer.
Yeah, so I started taking photos about 20 years ago, 2003. I was into art as a kid, but, mostly drawing, painting. Wasn't a good painter, but I like to draw. My parents were always like, you're going to work for Disney one day. That was in the 90s. That never happened. But I ended up going to my undergrad in Denver. Is where I grew up, outside of Denver, and studied photography at the Institute of Colorado, and did kind of like a commercial background in photography. I used to photograph a lot of action sports like skateboarding, snowboarding. Skateboarding was my kind of entry into photography. And I did that for a number of years in Colorado, shooting snowboarding, kind of went to snowboarding, and then kind of got tired of it about 5 years. Had a lot of fun, but the photos I felt were kind of just, I felt like I was selling snowboards. So I moved to San Francisco to kind of change things up. I followed a girl out there and kind of got more into editorial work, kind of documentary work. Did that for a bit, went to Alaska, did some commercial salmon fishing, ended up doing a project up there for 2 seasons. And it was kind of my first time doing kind of like a long form project. I did over 2 seasons, like I said, 10 years ago, 2013, 2014. Then came back, moved back to Denver, and then started doing editorial work pretty seriously. Going to New York, doing all the meetings, networking with other editorial photographers, and kind of did that for a few years in Denver before I moved to Nebraska about 5 years ago. So photography it's stuck for the past 20 years. it's always kind of been a struggle financially, but I've made it work somehow. Odd jobbing, doing all sorts of editorial, commercial work. I've done.
It's kind of how you have to do it. Yeah. I'm kind of curious, in your school, what was it about photography that attracted you? Let's go back to that pivotal moment where you were like, photography. What was it about photography?
I actually have no idea.
Really?
Yeah. So I went to military school in high school. I got sent there my junior year, and my dad died during that time. And so I went to school and was kind of like aimless, so I was about to graduate. My mom's like, what are you going to do for college? My brother went to CU to study film. I didn't really want to do that. She was like, what about this school? How about photography? And I was like, yeah, let's give it a try. I didn't take any photos before I went to college for photography. It was kind of weird.
Really?
Yeah. Being in military school, there was no art really. There wasn't any kind of culture that was pushing me towards the arts, but I went to school and just kind of fell into it. And my only kind of exposure to photography was skateboarding magazines, which it sounds ridiculous 20 years later, but I think
it was really big back then.
Yeah, it was huge.
It was huge back then. Especially late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah.
Yeah. Like late 90s is when I got into it. I graduated college, or I started college in 2003. And I think photographing, skateboarding, and snowboarding kind of gave me the work ethic to kind of move into what I'm doing today. You think of it as like, I don't know, just having fun, or like, the skateboarders, they work really hard. Snowboarders, there's a lot of work that goes into what they do. And so filming is pretty rigorous. And we spend a lot of hours out there, and it's really repetitive. So I kind of see that repetition relevant now. You would photograph someone doing a trick 50, 60 times or, more. And so that kind of has now translated into photographing trains and time. It's repetitive. It's kind of monotonous. So I see kind of overlap like that. But yeah, somehow it just stuck, and I became obsessed with it in college, like working in the darkroom, working with the all the gear you could get at the school. So I just kind of fell into it.
So what was that moment? Do you remember? Do you remember the moment where you were like, yes, this is it?
Yeah.
Did you have that moment, or did it just kind of like slow drip?
I think it happened probably my second semester. So I failed my first semester of class because I was using my mom's or my parents' camera, and it was like an old Pentax, but it didn't have a shutter speed. It was only aperture. And so the shutter button, you would just have to estimate. And none of my pictures turned out for the entire
first. It was like a bulb mode kind of thing where you had to.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't understand it. And my teacher was never
speed of your finger.
Yeah. She was never like, you shouldn't use this camera. So all my film kept coming out like crap. And so I kind of quit going to class, failed the 2 classes, and then got a new camera, and it like clicked, and I just loved it. Like loved being in the darkroom, the anticipation of processing film, and then all the hours printing. I got really into it, and it just took hold.
So now you you still shoot film, and I love the camera that you use. I hear a lot about the Mamiya. It's the Mamiya 6.7, RX 6.7, I think is what it is. I love that camera. I know a lot of people that shoot on that, but I don't. RZ, there you go. Yeah. All you Mamiya fans out there, I'm sorry. But I shoot on a Hasselblad, so I don't. It's the other one, Yeah. But it's just it's a kind of it's a fun game, That's interesting. Did you skate yourself? Were you a skater, or were you kind of out there just kind of documenting it?
Yeah,
you did.
I skated. I was pretty terrible. I was good like late high school years, but I still enjoyed it. I liked the culture of it. Snowboarding. I snowboarded. My dad is a ski patroller. we grew up skiing, snowboarding every weekend in Colorado. So that was always kind of part of what I grew up doing. And so it just felt kind of natural to transition into that. I don't do either anymore. Okay. I snowboarded for the first time over Christmas, and it was awesome. I haven't been in probably 8 years, but I don't go regularly. Obviously, there's no mountains in Nebraska, or hills for that matter.
No, there is not. Yeah. You're in that corn country, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Snowboarding on fresh powder there's nothing like it. It's like flying on a cloud. And that's what hooked me in snowboarding. I did a lot of that when I was younger. But I'm kind of curious too. So you did your initial studies in photography. You got the bug, like a lot of us do, and then you started to kind of chase it to see if you can make your life with that. And you got into editorial work. Was there anybody that was, I find along the way, especially someone that stays with photography and or art for a long time, that there was somebody that was significant that kind of helped them along the way. Maybe it was inspirational or a mentor or somebody. Do you have anybody like that was really significant for you?
Yeah. About 10 years ago, when I moved back to Denver after being in Alaska, I met my friend Ben Rasmussen. And he was in Denver. He was doing editorial work, and he kind of got me my first gigs. I'd go over and use a scanner. He would get a call from someone like the Times. He couldn't do a job, so he would just recommend me, who had never done any, jobs like that. I had been working with magazines for 5-6 years, snowboard editorial magazines, which is kind of a different program than kind of newspapers. But he kind of took me in, got me some gigs. He would email editors in New York when I would go to help me get meetings, and just kind of made me think about photography in a new way, and started showing me photo books and this kind of other world that I didn't really know existed, like Bloomberg and Shannon. I'm looking at my books over here. I'm like, what? Who is it? But people, he kind of introduced me to this larger, more thoughtful photographers. And we're still good friends.
I would say, yeah. I think that's interesting. Because usually you have somebody like that along your path that kind of does something. It's either gives a hand to you, start looking at your work, or starts kind of like lifting you up, in some ways. And I'm always curious about those people along the journey. And I often find when I'm giving advice to younger up and coming artists, I'm like, there's going to be someone that comes along your path that gives you a chance or starts to pay attention to what it is you're doing. You just got to keep going. And so I thought I'm always curious because I've started to find a common thread there. I'm also curious too, is that do you look at other photographers? Is there any photographers that you find inspirational, maybe artists or anybody that you look at that kind of is influential on you?
Yeah. I look at photography, I teach photography, so I have to look at it.
Of course.
But I tend to look more at like artists in general. I'm really attracted to like Robert Smithson, Donald Judd. I like to look at a lot of painting. I tend to, I don't look as much photography as, I don't know, some people, but I do, I buy photo books every now and then. I study the books. I like people like Peter Funch. You can never think of anyone off the top of your head when you have to think of it. But,
I'm putting you on the spot. Yeah.
I'm into like conceptual photography. I've been getting into it's Robert Compton. So stuff like that. I definitely look at art pretty regularly. Yeah.
I'm curious, why do you open up, why do you kind of why do you look at stuff outside of photography? Because I know some people are, they just stay within their genre and they kind of study the genre itself. But what is it about the larger image making or art world that is influential on you?
I think it's just the way that people think about things. Like, how do you structure a narrative with a different medium? And, actually literature is probably my biggest influence. I tend to lean on writing more for structure and experimentation than anything. I read pretty voraciously. I have a really strong reading practice. I read every morning for at least an hour throughout the day. I read, fiction, philosophy, theory, criticism, kind of all of it. But I think that I'm able to translate in a way that's photographic somehow. That looking at photography, it's kind of like you don't want to look at photographers to think about what to do. It's too close, right? You're trying to, and I don't really think I'm trying to do things differently, but when I'm thinking about a project or thinking about work I'm making, I don't want to compare it to something that's already being made. I want to translate it in a different way. So that's why I like literature or painting or sculpture as more of an inspiration.
Because it's just so far.
Yeah, it's different. Same
because it kind of removes you from it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of my research practice is, I think about it as kind of encompassing everything that you do. Right. So going for a walk.
Interesting.
Or, listening to people or overhearing people or, my students, everything is like you just being receptive to all things. And I think that's where my work comes from, is just kind of everyday life, not like research is like, okay, I'm going to read this book and write a thing on it. I'm just going to be receptive to the world. And that's how I kind of draw from it.
That is really, really interesting. And I think a very useful tip, I think, if you're an artist or whatever, just kind of how to look at research or at least look at visual research. I know research can translate itself into a topic itself where you're kind of diving into an idea or a concept or whatever, and that research takes on a different place. But when you're kind of doing your own kind of aesthetic research and kind of finding what is interesting to you, I like that holistic approach. And I don't think I've ever heard that. So how long have you been teaching? Are you teaching photography? You said photography itself?
Yeah. So I'm technically like a visiting professor of digital media and photography. So I right now I teach darkroom.
Oh, cool.
Darkroom photography. I teach a digital media course, and then I teach like a senior capstone. And I kind of alternate. In the fall, I do a kind of art research course for intro college students, and then I teach an intro to photo course, which is more digital. So it's nice to have, an intro class and then a darkroom class, which is technically more intermediate. So I've been teaching now. If I count my grad teaching assistantship, about 5, going on 6 years now.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's great. I think I think what you just said should be taught in the class. That's why I was like, I wonder how long you've been teaching, because that's some good stuff.
I try.
Going back to that kind of that research, and since we're kind of on this idea of, how you get your inspiration and where it comes from, I read in an interview, and I kind of want you to kind of unpack it for me. Because it really hit me. And it's about this receptiveness that you were talking about just a second ago. And you said being receptive is an inherently empathetic process. How much one feels the world ultimately leads to how much one reflects on it. Talk to me about that.
So, yeah, kind of when I think about the work that I make, I don't come up with the ideas. So I don't think what am I going to make work about? Like, that's not how I go about things. Usually it's, what am I experiencing in my life that is kind of causing me to feel something? And so I think about this concept or this idea of where art comes from. And I kind of take it from Gilles Deleuze, who says that, like, ultimately, you know, objective vibrations cause subjective sensations, right? So how the world makes you feel and what it causes inside of you. So I think about that. So if I think to the work that I make, it's usually me stumbling on something or running into something or something really catching my interest, and it won't quit, right? And so to me, that's like being receptive, right? You have to be open to engage with something, right? And so I think that's empathetic, right? Like, what are you feeling, right? Not just feeling for someone else, but what are you feeling from something or someone? And so that's, to me, where kind of my work comes from. And that is like, you know, it's recognizing influences or inspirations and acknowledging them and kind of leaning on that. Like, I don't think of myself as like a creator. I think of, you know, myself as more like a researcher who's making work about people or things that are more interesting than me. That's kind of my coming to my practice, right? It's like acknowledging that I'm just someone I see something, I, you know, reframe it, recontextualize it, and then put it out in my own way. But it's, you know, it already exists. It's not like I'm making something up new. So to me, that's kind of how I think about my work in the context of like of the world or a larger framework.
It seems like you have, you did say you read philosophy. So, do you find that kind of makes its way into your work?
Totally. Like, I sometimes go on these like tears of reading Deleuze, who is like the hardest person to read, right? Like, some of his books, I'm just like, why am I reading this? It doesn't make sense. But some of it, I feel like it makes so much sense conceptually, and it can translate because he's talking about general concepts. Usually it's not anything super specific to one thing. It's like this open-ended idea or concept that you connect to different frameworks. And so usually, like, I, you know, read a lot of that when I'm writing, and it kind of seeps in, I think. But what I like about it is that it's so hard to comprehend that it's like this challenge that's like perpetual, right? And you can never fully understand it. I can, at least. And so that's why I like engaging with philosophy, because I do find it very challenging. Like, I have no formal training in philosophy or, you know, didn't take any classes. I just kind of came to it. And I probably misinterpret a lot of it. That's probably the thing. But I do see it as a way to engage with work, or like as a kind of structure to help you engage.
Do you feel like images are kind of that same way? Do you think images have that same quality about it?
I think
like
so.
Like a really hard philosophy book that you read and you don't necessarily understand it fully, and but you keep going after it, and every time you do, you get something new, kind of thing. Do you think an image does that?
Yeah, because I think images, right, they're contextual. They're also referential. So looking at an image, like whenever I look at my work, it's always changing, right? Like it's hard to categorize sometimes or put it in a certain box about something. So I do think, you know, they are elusive, and they don't make sense every day. And sometimes you see something in it that kind of resonates one day, but then it doesn't the next. And I think that's just based on your kind of where you're coming from or what's happening in your life at that time.
You're kind of alluding to a few things that are kind of connecting dots for me right now about Terry's world here, you know, and it's you were talking about your approach to photography and how you're kind of doing all the projects all at the same time, and you're kind of adding as you go, and and you're to each kind of idea that you're kind of working with. And by doing so, it kind of gives you this ability to jump back into the archive and recurate a new set of images that has a kind of a new meaning to it. And I kind of see kind of a connection to what we just said in that approach. Do you understand where I'm going from? And do you think I'm kind of tapping into something here?
Yeah, I do think that, like I said, like I'm trying to, like, I'm not interested in necessarily like finishing projects because to me they're open-ended. They're like memories, right? The more you access it, the more they change, the more, they're kind of morphing into something else. And so by having this through line, right, this conceptual through line, I feel like I'm able to make these kind of larger connections that maybe aren't necessarily clear because, again, it depends on the viewer, right? Like one of the things I struggle with is in photography, like, let's say, I don't know, sometimes it's like you're making a project about one thing. It's about this. It's this like monographical kind of look at something small, right? And you have to talk about it simply and clearly and in 10 photos, right? To me, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, I think contests and all these, opportunities are kind of limiting, and I think they stunt projects. And
yeah, for sure.
Right? Like, if you have to submit 10 images and like a paragraph, how can that fully kind of represent the work that you're making over many years? So that's a whole different thing. But for my work, I do see it as connecting things, working on them perpetually, letting them change over time, trying not to force them into a book too soon or a boxer. Like, can you make something that just keeps going, right? Like, I guess it just depends on what you want to do with it or what you're trying to say, but I'm more interested in the kind of perpetual learning about a project or about a work. And, when it ends, most of my projects end because they ended on their own nature. They didn't end because I was like, okay, I'm done with this. It's time to move on. It's like the subject ended it or something external to me ended it. And that's usually how I move on from things, is when someone's like, it's done. And I'm like, all right. Instead of me being like, I finished it, it's done. Let's finish it. I don't usually finish things. That's kind of my thing.
Well, you can, I think there's something about that's quite interesting. And especially if you think about a project or an idea, it almost has a life of its own, and it kind of has a lifespan that is somewhat tangible. I often think about it, you have these memories or these times at a particular city. You remember that 10 years here, or that 2 years there, or that 1 year here, and ideas and projects almost are kind of like that. They're experiences that unfold. We just happen to record it for however long that we're a witness to the experience. And then we try to make sense of it by putting together a series or making a book or thinking about it. And what I think is quite interesting, and I'm kind of curious your thought on this, and then I'll ask you a little bit about kind of the subject matter that you have, is I have a mentor that tells me that no situation is two-sided. Some people like to say that there's two sides to every situation, and it's like one, you flip the other side, then you see the other perspective. But she always tells me that every situation is like a diamond. It has many facets to explore, and it's got many faces to one idea. Do you think by doing your approach that you get exposed to that kind of perspective? Do you see what I'm asking you here? Do you feel like you get a chance to really see something because of that approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a fragmented way of looking at things, right? I mean, or kaleidoscopic, where you can't,
That's
like to work in iterations or series that sometimes take different approaches on the same subject or same idea. And I think that, not like cubism or, where it's like multi-sided, but taking different, coming back to things is a way of looking at things, I think, from different perspectives. And that's why I do like to keep coming back to things, like in a kind of recursive way that can have that similar kind of fragmented view of things. So yeah, I'm all about.
And that's the thing is, and that's kind of what I'm curious about is that discovery. And because you do something like that and you kind of take that approach, do you find that you come to understand a certain subject matter or a perspective in a different way every time you do that? Do you think the way you think about a subject evolves and you're kind of adding more pages to the book where you only thought it was one page long and now there's so much more to it? I'm curious about that because, I see a lot of, it seems like I wouldn't say a lot, but there are some projects that I feel are kind of didactic in a way. They're kind of either one-sided and presenting it against another, and I feel like there's way more to that. My mentor is just in my brain right now saying that there's way more to it. That diamond versus a two-sided coin kind of situation. And I'm curious your perspective because of the way you the way you work. You might have a nugget here that might offer some clarity to my musings, if you know what I'm saying. So, do you feel like you get that kind of perspective because of that approach? I keep digging on it because I'm curious. I think that internet project that we're going to take a look at a little bit later might be one of those kinds of things where you keep going to it, you know what I mean? And you're exploring kind of this thing, but you're seeing different facets of a larger thing, And so that's kind of where I'm kind of diving into a little bit, I guess, just to pull out one of your examples.
Yeah. I do think by adding layers onto something complex, right, you're hoping to get a better understanding. But I think sometimes to me, I tell myself that I think I'm interested in complicating understanding to prolong the experience of wrestling with something. It's like reading philosophy, right? Like you read it and
no,
like,
100%
that doesn't make any sense. I got to read this again. And you're like, still did not make sense.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
And then, but to me, what's really interesting is like misperceptions, making errors in judgments, like physiological errors, right? Perceptive errors. To me, that's where things get interesting and you can get new perspectives on things, right? Like being wrong about something is kind of fascinating in a way when you're trying to understand something complex. And I think that's what I've really been interested in the past 5 or 6 years is kind of how we process and how we make mistakes. And so I think, right, like, yeah, you can be an expert or really knowledgeable on something, but you'll never fully get it, right? Like I don't really fully understand myself. As much as I think about myself, I'm always changing and I can't really pin it down. And I think about my work too. And I think, it's hard to want to like end an experience or wrap up a project and be like, okay, this is ready. Like, I don't know. I just want to keep trying to make sense of it. And so I think,
I think there's a lot of people that can relate to that. I don't know how many people I've heard say that. They'll say that I just don't think it's done yet. You know what I mean? Or I don't know when to stop it. And there's a natural life to it, I think, that you're kind of alluding to. And it's a really interesting perspective. And I don't know that I've heard someone be so honest about or be straightforward about that kind of that kind of approach, which is great, because when you don't put something down, you keep going and you make it complicated, and you kind of keep looking at a situation and see it continue to unfold. It almost seems like you're like, what am I doing now? You know what I mean? It's like, it's almost confusing and can be cumbersome in some ways. But there's something about it that I think is quite universal, especially when you're thinking about big ideas. So that leads me to my next question, which is, we're going to look at a few projects from you today, and let's kind of take a look at what kind of ideas and concepts do you find yourself looking at? What do you find yourself working on most of the time?
Like currently? Or
yeah.
like
or your the projects that we're going to look at today. What kind of ideas do you explore? What kind of images and stuff? What pulls your attention and makes you take an image?
A lot of these days I find myself I make a lot of books. I taught myself how to like bind by hand about 7 years ago. I've been making dummies and maquettes and very small editions. And I find myself just reworking books kind of perpetually. But I'm really, it kind of goes back to that, like, what do I make work about? Well, I don't make work about things that I like set out to make things about. I make work about things that I run into or kind of connect serendipitously on, right? Like, because I don't say, I think I want to make work about this, it's usually like a natural thing that I experience that I'm like, okay, what is this? I need to further explore this. And so, the first project we're going to look at, to me, that project is a little different in the way that it started. It started definitely in a way that was very personal to me, but also very like I didn't know anything about it. And that's also one of the things is like, I photograph things that I don't know about when I begin, and which is always makes for a really interesting discovery along the way. And so, should I share some of the work?
Let's go in order. Yeah, we can take an opportunity now to kind of like dive in and let's get a look at what you do.
This project is called "But the Eyes Are Blind, One Must Look with the Heart," and I started in 2015, and it was kind of at a point in my life where I was in a relationship, and it was kind of turbulent in ways. It's kind of like a lot of relationships. It kind of was kind of fizzing out a little bit. And I think I was trying to understand better how I was feeling through connecting with other people. And so there used to be this thing called casual encounters on Craigslist. I'm sure many of you know what Craigslist is. It's still around, but casual encounters was kind of closed down by the federal government in 2018, which is when the project ended, as soon as that kind of happened. And I was using it as a kind of vehicle to explore like the tendency to seek like human connection, but the failure to find it. So I was kind of drawing on this concept of absurdity by Kierkegaard, who was definitely interested in that kind of isolation, human isolation. And so I started out just putting, I put an ad up saying I'm a photographer, I'm looking to photograph people. The concept isn't that new, right? This work kind of gets a lot of like Soth armchairs from like Niagara or like Christian Patterson armchairs because there's neon. So it has these kind of tropes in it. But I was using Craigslist in a kind of an authentic way to meet with people. And the only people that really responded were men, usually older men, but kind of all sorts of men. Women weren't really active on there. Most women on there were they seemed to be bots or, phishing. They weren't actually women. It was this kind of, and you can search in men for men for women. if you search for men for women, it was mostly spam. But for men, there was actually men out there that would respond, and, you know, you'd have correspondence. So this project was definitely approached anonymously, because Craigslist is an anonymous platform. So I created a pseudonym that I worked with. Most people communicated with the pseudonym. And so it was kind of this really kind of like exciting way to connect with people. And obviously there is a sexual connotation because you're in Men for Men. So there's kind of like, you know, there's always like an elephant in the room. Like, okay, when is this going to go to the direction of people, you know, on casual encounters? And it was exciting to work on for the first couple years. But it caused a lot of tension in my relationship because it was so kind of unknown and seedy in ways, you know. So this first image is a motel in Denver that I went to meet a man. And usually when I'm going to meet people, I didn't know who they were, what they looked like. I'm kind of trusting them, you know. And there is the context of I am a photographer and I'm coming here to make your photograph, right? And there will be no kind of sexual kind of interactions happening. It's purely photographic and conversational. And it ended up being really like kind of positive because I would listen to these people. They would want to talk to me, and they would just tell me about their experiences with romance or looking for someone or trying to find a partner. And it became a really meaningful, kind of powerful experience for me. But sometimes it was tense.
You used a word exciting, and I'm kind of curious about why was it so exciting?
I think because it
seems almost kind of nerve-wracking.
Yeah, you know, like it had this like there was this mystery, right? You're going to this house, person you don't know, to photograph them, who is looking for some sort of interaction or experience. And, you know, there's always kind of a like, you know, Craigslist casual encounters is very sexually charged and sometimes aggressive, right? So I'm kind of going into these positions blind with no photos, you know, with all my camera gear, and I would show up dragging a suitcase with, you know, a light stand and a tripod and a Mamiya RZ, and, you know, and they didn't expect that. Sometimes they would expect a guy with an iPhone or just a camera and just take some pictures and then kind of mess around. And so it kind of reversed expectations of them to be like, oh, this is actually a thing, right? And it became, a lot of them would be like, you know, they would tell me things that they never told someone else. I became this kind of, you know, listener to them. But the first ones, you know, it was like kind of scary in ways, you know, and you're going to places that are kind of seedy, like these motels or sex shops or, you know, houses way out in the suburbs. So there was kind of this excitement, and all my friends were like, oh, you should like tell people before you go to these places. Sometimes I did, most of the time I didn't.
Yeah.
But, you know, and I met these men who were very nice and welcoming and very warm. And I think they just wanted to be seen and heard, because Craigslist is kind of notorious, or was notorious, for people flaking out or not showing up or just looking, you know, for whatever, I don't know. So I started making these portraits of these men, and it became, as time went on, it became really like meaningful and kind of important. And it was hard to get in people's homes. Like sometimes I would have to talk with them for months before they would kind of let me in. And some people would just within 2 emails invite me over. So you kind of never knew what you were going to find. So I went to everyone that said yes, no matter what they looked like, no matter who they were, as long as they were respectful in the email and, weren't like expecting things like sexual favors or stuff like that. And I ended up photographing quite a number of men and women. And I was using Backpage also at the time, which is also now shut down due to sex trafficking reasons. And yeah, it just became this kind of this look into like the banalities of kind of cybernetic, sexual encounters. And, a lot of times it was just photographing men like in their rooms. I photographed, this is a male chastity that a man would wear that would lock. And so there's like these really complex things happening, right? And so for this man to get a key, he would have to call or email another man who was out of the city and ask permission for a key, and then they would mail the key. And so he would, these experiences are like, there are so many things happening, right? And I found it really fascinating. Like
what was it about? What was fascinating to you? Was it like the human condition? Was it this? What were you seeing? What was intriguing to you?
I think just being let into people's lives on such a personal and kind of deep level, even though it was still kind of surface level, it was still the context of coming into someone's home. They're revealing personal things about them, not just like physically their body, but also things they would tell me. And yeah, I was really into it psychologically. And some of these men, they had really some had really terrible stories about their past that they wanted to share, like, losing family members or people dying or, being divorced or stuff like that. And they would just kind of open up to me. And so it became really personal. And at the time, it was also kind of reflecting my own relationship, which was struggling for connection at the same time. So, and I didn't realize this for years later, that sometimes I'm looking for things that are a mirror of myself. So by photographing these men who are searching for love, I'm also someone who is searching for love in a way, a connection, and not finding it in the same way that they're not finding it. So we would have our own little small connections just in this time that were really meaningful to me.
Doing this project, was there anything shocking that you discovered?
Not really, right? Like, I wouldn't say.
What do you mean by that?
I don't, like, when you say shocking, I don't know.
I think the fact that you're questioning the word shocking itself is interesting. So was there something banal about it that you discovered? Something common? Like, I'm curious what a discovering might be. Like, a lot of times, when you take on something like this that has such a interesting thing that a lot of people probably would never do, and you could tell that there is a sense of discovery here. I'm curious about what it is you discovered, and it didn't seem like it was shocking. So, like, what did you find out? What did you discover in all of this?
I think, one of the things I discovered was that a lot of these people, right? It's like, when I think of the title, "But the eyes are blind, one must look with the heart," that comes from The Little Prince. And I photographed a dominatrix, and it was tattooed right above her, like on her pubic bone. And I kind of interpreted that as, in this world, it's not what you look like, it's kind of the feeling that you can bring or give someone, right? It's like a deeper kind of, you're looking for something deeper than like a visual connection, right? You want to feel a connection with someone, and it doesn't matter who it is. It's just like, give me some feeling. And I don't think that's, I'm not interpreting the context of the book, just in the context of this work. And I think one of the things I found out was some of these people would go to like great lengths to make this happen, right? some would tell me that they're like, on Craigslist, they're cheating on their spouse, they're cheating on their partner, they're, having, homosexual relationships while they're in a straight marriage. And to me, anything was fine. I wasn't there to judge people or, tell them what they're doing was wrong. All I wanted to do was listen to them and see them. And sometimes it was very uncomfortable. Some people were like, I want you to do this to me. And I was like, there are boundaries here. Like this man wanted, he gave me 3 things to do. One was to wash his mouth out with soap. One was to apply makeup to his face. And the other involved feces. I chose putting the makeup on his face. But it's like I'm interacting and, again, this man is much larger than me. So there is kind of, there's some weird dynamics happening that, and if you look at Hollywood, if Hollywood depicts something like this, it's usually kind of stereotypical and violence is involved sometimes. And so there are these kind of connotations that you think might happen, but nothing ever happened that was dangerous or violent or negative. People were really trusting, and I, kind of trusted them in return. And so this work, it's kind of taken, I haven't published the work. I haven't shown it. It's kind of just been this work I made that was really, to me, visually powerful and kind of pivotal in my life. And it's just kind of been on the back burner, just hanging out.
I think it's fascinating because I remember Craigslist and I remember that section, and that I remember my friends and even people would say, don't do anything on there, you'll get killed, Yeah. And so then you hear about this Craigslist killer, serial killer later, but it's a really interesting world into the faces behind those ads. You could just have an imagination about who was posting stuff on there. And, I remember Craigslist was really, really interesting. And so was that kind of what your initial fascination was, kind of curious who's behind these things, and yeah. And then you kind of discovered a little bit about it. And I just think that's interesting. How do you see this making its way into the world? Do you think it's going to be one of those books you craft yourself, or how do you see this kind of making its way out there?
I made an edition of 10 books probably 6 years ago that I sent around to some contests and never really had any kind of results from it. And I think about still, publishing a small trade edition of some sort, but I haven't been pushing it for whatever reason, maybe because it just feels old, even though I know work that was made, 10 years ago isn't technically old. And sometimes I think that it looks like the way I photograph things seem typical of the time, or, kind of get armchaired. But that didn't really matter to me because I think it's different than a lot of the work that was made about situations like this, or like people looking for love. And you see a lot of work like this still. And I do think it is relevant, or was relevant, especially during COVID and the, kind of isolation. People were looking, in and looking to experience things online. But I'm not sure I'm totally okay with kind of sitting on it for now. And, if a publisher is interested, or I do find something, I'm open to it, but I'm also open to it just kind of aging, kind of hanging out in the background a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah. I think the implications of Craigslist in that section of that part of the internet, I think we're going to look back at this time, maybe 20 years from now, and just think about the implications of that time and all of that stuff that was going on, and think about our world, because, our world is shifting quickly, and it's changed a lot with the way we interact with each other online. And I think Craigslist and social media and some of these other sites, the way we connect with each other in this website, I think you're right about sitting on it. Because it might be 30 years before we go, oh yeah, I remember that. It might be one of those situations, and it might be a fascinating time capsule of a brief period of time where people were connecting with each other in really interesting ways. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it has, like, for those that were on Craigslist casual encounters at the time, right? I mean, Tinder was out, Grindr was out, all, apps were still on there, but there was a certain kind of person that would go on Craigslist. To me, it's almost like a, it's like timeless in a way. It's more obsolete. It doesn't have the, like, kind of technological kind of means to it, right? It's dated. But yet it was like this very, people were very active on it. But it was also a very small world. Like, I worked on it for 3 years, and I over time I would change my pseudonym because I'd get a lot of the same people would respond to my ads, or I would see the same stuff. So I kind of would switch it up just to see what else I could find or who else. But it feels older. Like the people that I, met just seem to be not like a demographic, but you can kind of tell about the people, about the way they use technology through it, which I found really fascinating.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. So this project was a kind of a shift away from a project that you were doing before. Are we about to look at that one next?
So yeah, this project came before. So I worked on this from 2015 to 18. And then the work we'll look at now, I started in 2018 when I moved to Nebraska to go to grad school. And let's see, I'll share this. So this work is called The Watcher, and it was made within 3 months of 2018, from August to November. It was my first semester of grad school, and one day I stumbled upon this man, Craig, who I thought was watching birds, and turns out he was watching trains, and he had been watching trains since 1983 from this one parking lot. And I was on my bike, and I was just riding to the park one day on the weekend, taking some time off, and I got stuck behind a train, and I waited for this train to pass. And when I passed, he was getting out of his car, which he parks in this parking lot, and I just decided to talk to him. And he told me that, he was 85. He had a stroke just 2 months ago, or maybe recently had a stroke, and his wife died just before that. And he's just been watching trains in this parking lot since 1983. And he told me he did it for 11 years and 6 days consecutively. And he filled notebooks, these spiral notebooks, in his car. He just had a whole stack of red notebooks. And after I met him, I went on my bike ride, and it was like I was just, hit like a train by this guy. And the next day...
No pun intended.
Yeah. The next day, and I had a different project I was working on at the time that we're not going to talk about. And I just went home or to my studio, and I just put it in a box, and I haven't pulled it out since. And I started this work the next day. And so this work was a departure for me in the sense that it was very kind of forensical. To me, it's like a non-aesthetic. It's like becomes surveillance. It's repetitive. It was a whole different way of working and interacting with the subject. And it changed my life. It made me think about the world differently. I'd never had a body of work kind of act so strongly on me, just towards the way that I like exist in the world. And for me, time, it started to slow down. So
explain that, unpack that for me.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull up some different images here. So Craig had a stroke, and I was talking to him about it. I'm like, well, what did you feel? How was your experience? And he's like, it didn't hurt, but he's like, some days I don't remember my name. I don't know what day it is. I don't, he's kind of missing all this information, but he knows to drive all the way across town and park in the same spot. He sits in his passenger seat and he fills these notebooks methodically, 2 notebooks of train activity. And there was a professor on my committee who had a stroke and kind of direct me towards aphasia, which can be affect your speech, like a loss of speech, but it can also affect your vision and a loss of vision. And it only works the left field of vision on both eyes with respect to whatever you're looking at. It's always on the left side. Because what happens is that your visual pathways in your eyes, they crisscross and they connect in the back of the brain and they're like flipped. So with aphasia, you can have a lesion in your like kind of right temporal pathway that will affect the left field of your vision. And this was all, this was real physiological research, but I speculated it about Craig, right? I never asked them, like, have you had an aphasia battery? I didn't ask him these big questions like, what do you see? Stuff like that. I just kind of speculated that, okay, maybe he has aphasia and maybe he's missing part of what he's seen because he has these notes. I can probably find a better picture. But on the left, he notes the time and then the locomotive numbers. He counts the trains. He writes what kind of train it is, the direction it's heading, and all that information. But then there are these like tick marks, these scratch blanks of where I think he's forgetting or kind of losing like focus or consciousness in a way, which kind of manifests in these visual errors in his notes. And at the same time, my camera broke one day when I was photographing, and I started to have these visual errors in my camera. But if I go back, the very first day I met him, I photographed him with my iPhone, and when I went home to download the images, they were all scrambled and mixed up and kind of broken. And I was like, my phone had a stroke. This is like serendipitous. This is connected to Craig. And then it happened again in my process. And so I became really interested in like how we see and what does it mean to see and what does it mean not to see. And so I just started thinking about this man who just sits in his car for, 8 to 10 hours a day, every day, right? Like, and I just found it incredibly fascinating. And I kind of developed this process of photographing him and interacting with him that was based on a book called The Peregrine, which was this man who was tracking a peregrine falcon. And he said that in order to kind of follow a peregrine, you have to gain its trust. So you have to show up at the same time, wearing the same clothes, smelling the same, making the same movements, all kind of in repetition. And you can't deviate from that if you want to like get closer to this falcon. So I took the same approach with him because I was like, all right, this man has been watching trains here since longer than I've been born. and I didn't want to bother him or be annoying. So I would come and I would photograph this spot first, and I would kind of, my sense of time would change. So I would set up here on my tripod and I would photograph him until an entire train came. So no matter how long it took for a train to come, I would wait there until that train passed. So it was like an exercise in patience, because I thought about this man who's just sitting here 8 hours a day patiently in his car counting trains. And so I wanted to kind of bring that same process to my work. So I'd start there, and then I would move to the right of him. And let's see if I don't have all the photos here. But I would photograph him from a different angle, and then I would move like a clock around his car and photograph from all these different angles. And actually you can see it in the book. Let's see. Okay. So I would start here and then there, and then I'd get close to him and then move around him. And I'd do that every day. And in the book, it's chronological. The book spans a week to just have a time scale. And then I would also put these interstitial images that were kind of like this out of focus image that was more trying to get at perhaps when he forgets or isn't seen correctly. And then here's when I would even photograph him when he wasn't there in the same way, because I started to understand that what he's doing is a ritual act, and it becomes mechanical. And so I would kind of move in a mechanical, ritualistic way myself. And then I would have these interstitial images that would connect each day. So
did he ever allude to why he does that?
He just said he likes trains. He never had a big, deep philosophical answer. He never, was just like, I met a man who watched trains, and I went out with him, and then he started watching trains. And it was like the same thing. I met him, and then I started watching trains. It's like contagious. You meet a train watcher, and then you become a train watcher. So in a way, I kind of...
Are there a lot of people that are kind of train watchers in this regard, or no?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I started to meet a lot of them. There would be more train watchers would show up and park next to him. And they would talk trains, and they would count trains. And everyone had their own system of notation. But they all notated something. I had my system. He has his. Another guy had theirs. It became this like whole world that I had no idea existed. Like I met a 11-year-old boy whose dad would drive him around, and he would sit there and film on his iPad, and then he would make recordings, and he had a model train set at home. It's a world.
Wow. So, okay. And he's been doing this so he always came same time, left at the same time, and just kind of did this. And so you tried to match that. I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked you in the previous series, which was there any interesting discoveries that you found about doing this? I know you said this changed your life. Like,
yeah, I mean,
talk to me a little bit about that. Like, what did you discover? How did it change you? Like, talk to me about that.
So my whole kind of understanding of time changed, and everything became slower. I became more patient. I became more mindful. I kind of started doing like mindfulness practice, not like meditating necessarily, but kind of being more aware of my awareness. I also started kind of watching trains, not in the way that he did, but I would go out and kind of seek different trains. But I think I discovered a lot just about like humans, right? When I think about him, I'm like, this guy knows who he is. There's no doubt about it. He wakes up, he drives here, right? And he's retired at this point, which helps. But he started doing this in his 50s. And there was something really comforting about him always being there, right? Like I knew I could always find him. And there were like logical explanations for days that he wasn't there. Like it snowed, It was too cold. It was Sunday. He went to church. But I knew every other day I could find him, right? And now he no longer watches. I think, with his stroke, possibly dementia, I think his kids are like, you can't drive 10 miles anymore to do this. But at the time, it was like this, like my mind was exploding with thinking about what this man was doing. And then also thinking about trains, their systems, right? No train is ever the same. A train goes one place, it breaks down, it gets rebuilt, it moves to another, right? There's this kind of stereotype that all trains are the same, right? You've seen one train, you've seen them all. The combination of trains is in the billions, right? Like you'll never see the same train, right? You may see the same engine, but you'll never see the same set or same system of trains. And so I found that kind of the infrastructure of trains really fascinating, and thinking about that in narrative ways, right? Like you can get to one train track from all train tracks, right? They're all connected, right? It's moving forward, it's moving backwards. There's junctions, there's disjunctions, there's breakdowns. They're like doing all sorts of different things. They go forward, they come back. They go forward, they come back, forward. Like there's like the way it messes with people, right? This is at throat of a train yard, so it's high activity. There's 5 tracks, and sometimes it will block traffic for over an hour. And so then I started watching people and being like, okay, who's going to wait for this train? And so I started thinking about it as this like practice in being mindful, because people would show up and they would turn around. And so I started photographing all the people that would show up. And I started photographing all the cars and the planes. And so it kind of became about everything else, right? And the joke about this project is that it's not about trains, right? None of my work is about trains. Trains are just like a mode for delivering information or understanding something. It's like a metaphor.
Fascinating.
Because
go ahead.
No.
No, I'm going to use the metaphor of trains here, and use what you were saying is how does since we're talking about connections, how do you see these two connecting to each other? Because I kind of see a connection here. So, but I'm kind of curious what you think the through line between your previous body, because you did that from 2015 to 2018. You started a new work, you put it down, and started this one. So I'm seeing a leap into this one. Well, what do you think the common thread is here?
Well, I think mainly it's desire. And like in the internet work, there's a desire for connection and for understanding and desire for love. And I think in the watcher, right, to me, his binoculars is a symbolic representation of desire, right? He's sitting in this car. He desires to see, he desires to get close to, connect in a different way, right? And so I think that's one of the forms, but I think the larger connection kind of spins out of the watcher into the other train work, which becomes more about simulation, world building, desire, nostalgia. I think, as much as this project visually breaks and thematically, right? Like trains have nothing to do with the internet sex. But I still see them as, right? I mean, both the titles are about vision, right? Which to me is kind of a coincidence, but the eyes are blind, the watcher. But there's always this misperception happening, right? With the watcher, it's his stroke that's affecting the way he sees. In the internet work, there's kind of a blindness in operating, right? Like you can't see the person you're talking to. It doesn't really matter. You just want that connection. You want that comfort. And I think the watcher is like trains are also a source of comfort to Craig, right? Because he goes to the place where they're the busiest. So they're always there. You can always count on a train to come. A train, it's not like, where are the trains today? It's like, how many trains will you see today is kind of the question. And that was always really exciting for him because someday he'd be like,
and so that's a great way to kind of slide into how this evolved. You kind of went from someone that was watching it into how people simulate that, or kind of you went a little deeper into that world. Did it stem from seeing other people that came and watched the trains and meeting the kid that was also doing that? You're like, there's a bigger world here. Is this what kind of inspired this next project?
Yeah,
this is the one that ended up in Urbanatica, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So the Watcher was like, it was like that gateway into trains. Because, after I finished the Watcher, and after I made the book, I still went and photographed him. I continued to photograph for 2 more years, but never really made anything of it. I'm kind of still working on a Watcher book, like a larger kind of anthology of it. But it did, because it touched on so many different kind of nodes with trains, like world making, capitalism, time, like philosophy, difference in repetition, rituals. It kind of did, because once I met more train watchers, they're like, oh yeah, you should come check out my model train set, or you should come to the train expo, or, oh yeah, we all get together and watch trains together on Sunday. You should come with us. Or, it was like leading me out, because the Watcher was made only in a parking lot. The whole work was just one parking lot. And I made, about 10 or 11,000 images of trains in that parking lot. So this world being so small was huge. And so Take Your Time was kind of trains in the world. And it was more kind of like, it was like a series in movement, and kind of looking at the structured world and then how we build these structured worlds. So there was meta kind of ideas involved in it, because now we're working with modeling, we're working on different time scales, and it just seemed like a logical, progression in my grad school, which was 3 years. So like, okay, I've now become the train guy in my little group. I might as well keep going on this tangent. So
interesting person, and there's so much about Craig that is you're pointing to so many things, the ritualness, and and how a stroke changes a person,
Yeah.
But it sometimes it can exaggerate somebody's habits that they had before, and so it's an interesting exploration into to that, and seeing the evolution here is really interesting. So let's take a look at this next series, and we'll kind of dive into it a little bit.
So yeah, this was the kind of follow up, and this again, the way that I've structured this work, which is, I call it Take Your Time, which kind of has multiple meanings, right? One, it's go slow, take your time. Trains are slow. Trains are sleepy. Trains are obsolete. They're working really hard, and they're, kind of in the way. They are, they work so hard at what they do. Like a train pulls millions, like 35 million tons of coal in one train, and it's like this amazing thing, but yet the technology is incredibly obsolete, and it's incredibly kind of outdated, right? And so this work really kind of got me diving into the history of trains, which also coincided with the history of photography, which I find really fascinating. Trains kind of came around in the early 19th century. Prototypes were kind of being made late 18th century. Steam was coming around in the 19th century. Photography, 1839, that same kind of area. But once the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, it kind of changed the way that time was experienced on like a world level. And I find that really fascinating as a concept historically to work within contextually. So this work, it looks at other aspects. So take your time also means collecting like slices of time, it's photographically. There's, like I said, there's a meta narrative implied in this work with not just models, but also with how time is kind of represented in different ways. So I traveled around the country and I started making this work pretty much in 2020. So I started doing road trips the summer of COVID. And, in Nebraska, Wyoming, COVID wasn't really recognized in a lot of these rural areas, which was really interesting to work within. And so here, this is at the Golden Spike Monument in Utah, Promontory, Utah, where the Southern Pacific met Union Pacific in, I think it was 1869, where the driving of the Golden Spike. This is where the two tracks met. And now it's a national park, and they have two trains that are replicas of the original trains that were built in the 1860s. And multiple times a day, they have a reenactment where the trains meet, they kind of nudge noses, they blow steam, and it kind of is this representation of the driving of the Golden Spike in 1869. So when the Golden Spike was hit, they wrapped telegraph wire around the spike and hit it. And so it sent a signal that signaled modern time, like new time. And I find that incredibly fascinating, right? The trains, when the train infrastructure was built, they built telegraph lines around it or with it. So it became this not only mode of transport, but a mode of communication and information. So it was called like the age of information. Trains could take photographs. Trains could now carry messages. And it's like these multiple things kind of coming together in one system. And that's kind of my interest in trains, is all the sprawling networks with transportation, tourism, communication, information.
Industrial Revolution. It's all of it. Yeah. You could now move tons of raw materials to manufacturing sites.
Yeah.
It's go ahead.
But at the same time, it's like, the irony of this is like, obviously, world making is also a form of world destruction in this context, right? Like the U.S. was building this railroad through Native American land, right? For every mile that the Transcontinental Railroad was built, the government gave the train line like 20 miles in north and south or east or west of every line. So property was just being eaten up by the train, all the resources along this train line, right? Like Union Pacific was digging coal mines to run their trains. Southern Pacific was building timber mills to mill wood for their tracks. When you go to this reenactment, you can see they used different, like the train pilings, like the logs. You can see that they're different, right?
Railroad ties.
Yeah. Railroad ties. And so they're consuming all this resource, like land, but they're also destroying the world as they built. So there's kind of this dynamic with the trains. And this work obviously doesn't look at everything. It's not all encompassing,
sure.
But
yeah.
It does, when I made this work, I would pretty much just follow train lines and kind of photograph everything that would catch my attention. So, I would talk to people, I would go to different towns, and I always slept on the train line because I liked being disoriented by them in the night, right? Like they'd wake me up, I wouldn't know what direction they're coming from. It was kind of this immersive experience of following the trains that was really this kind of fun. And, yeah, I would meet these characters. Like, this is Dwayne Sam in Crawford, Nebraska, and he worked for Santa Fe Railroads in the 50s and 60s. And now he's retired. He has a barn full of all the kind of train paraphernalia he built, like trestles and windmills and bridges, trains he built. You know, he has this G gauge track in his yard that he runs. And I just knocked on his door one day, and he took the time to show me everything and let me photograph him and was telling me about his stories. And so I kind of met people like that. And this is in his garage. You got the beard stat in the back. So it's like worlds within worlds. Everything is referential, right? It's based on actual places or imagined places. Like this layout is probably built from, you know, all the kind of structures he built. So everything is like kind of like typological. It's in multiples. There were just all these really interesting concepts happening through this kind of experience of following trains and things I found really interesting.
What do you think it is? What do you think it is that fascinates people about trains? I've always been curious. What do you think it is?
I mean, I think, you know, it's hard like to think about trains today because they are kind of this slow moving, you know, like, right, like this kind of beast.
I would say trains in the United States are that way because trains are such a big part of life here in Europe. So but like in the US, it's more manufacturing uses.
Yeah, so
you don't really see passenger trains and all that other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a larger conversation about capitalism. But I think, you know, all my work and my research only focuses on freight trains, right? Specifically, like not specifically, because like I said before, right? Like I'm receptive to what's around me, to my surroundings. Commuter trains can't be part of it, right? I could go to Chicago and do something like commuter trains, but I'm interested in what I see. And the freight trains in Lincoln, Nebraska, you know, have a huge presence, right? We're kind of in this pocket of train activity. And, you know, Omaha was, you know, or Council Bluffs, right outside of Omaha is where the Transcontinental Railroad started. So there is a lot of history here. But I think, you know, in the 1850s and 60s, trains changed the world. They changed the experience of time and space. You know, it obliterated distance. It changed the way that we think about times. It created time zones, right? Like Einstein's theory of relativity was formulated based on like trains, right? He worked on timetables in Switzerland. I think there's just so many things to them, right? And they're revolutionary also. They were, right? And that's what I find interesting now is how kind of dated they've become, but still kind of, they're still present. And so that's what I'm really interested in is reversing the way that trains are now, right? So now you take a train, you only do it if you have time. It's slow. It's, you know, only for tourism mostly. It doesn't make sense to get on a train when you can fly somewhere cheaper and faster. So it's like trains are this mode of taking your time and they're going slow and you have to wait for trains and they get in your way and they're kind of like their effect on time is fascinating even today.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I guess my original question was, you know, before I made the point about the difference between the way our interaction in Europe with it versus the interaction in the US. And I'm kind of reflecting on what you're saying. It's because I do remember it a lot of the way that you're saying it, you know? But what was also so fascinating to me was I knew someone, her father was in the railroad and they also had all this paraphernalia and, you know, they also had, all of the train modeling and stuff like that, which I thought was quite fascinating. And what was interesting to me was, do you think it was the historical context and kind of this recognition of its importance that made people fascinated in world building, you know, a train set? I'm kind of curious into that insight. It's like, how do people find their way here?
So I had this really fascinating conversation with an art historian at UNL about this. And I was explaining to her, what these men do. And she goes, okay, so let me get this straight. So these men are reconstructing like past worlds from when they learned to like navigate the world. Because so I photographed this one man, and which is not this man, who built a layout in his basement that was modeled after the town where his wife is from and where I think they met. And so it's this kind of small town in Missouri. And she interpreted it as like, okay, so they're it's like this nostalgic thing of them reconstructing their past when they learned to drive, right? The modeling was based on the 50s, right? He's now in his, it's like 50s and 60s. So he was like a kid kind of growing up, right? And what I found is that it is, I think, this nostalgic thing for, reliving the past. It's the same with this man, right? So to me, when he operates his track, he's reliving his days of being a engineer, 50 years ago. It's this train time.
Yeah, I see that.
Kind of transfer of mentation where you're now like, they even have different time scales for operating model trains, right? Time is sped up. So an hour could be 8 hours of time in real world time. And so there's all these time scales, and they even run their trains on actual manifests that are from the past, right? Which I find very fascinating, right? You're getting these manifests, you're just moving trains and systems of a time that had already passed. So I do think a lot of that is about reliving things and going backwards, because most of these train sets you see, they're not futuristic. They're not built on new worlds. They're built from old worlds. It's this referential building that I find really fascinating.
100%. Yeah. When you see the trains here in Europe, they're just cutting edge, They're fast. They're on a great time schedule. Yeah. It's so much quicker than moving around in a car. So you just get so used to it. But there's a systematic system thing to it. And I think that's quite fascinating. And that the reliving the nostalgia, when you are meeting these people and going through this, one thing that I have noticed in this work and the previous work is this thing that I like to call radical openness. There is I tell people all the time, if you want to change your life, practice this level of radical openness to the world. And one of the things, and then don't judge that comes through. You're going to be meeting people and experiencing things that are going to radically change the way you look at life and the way you see things. And I noticed this about you here with both of these projects, because you can in so many ways look in both things. You can have people that are just not open to life, and they'll meet these people and just think, oh, this is just ridiculous, and dismiss the whole thing. But you're not. You're slowing down. You're being mindful. You're paying attention to people that probably you're one of the few people that has ever probably taken any interest in them, and in them and what they're interested in and what they do and so on. And I just can't help but find a sense of compassion that you're finding here, and I'm curious where that comes from. Because you're doing something, you're giving gifts to people by your attention. And I'm curious where that comes from.
I think this goes back to the being receptive, right? Is it empathetic? And, when I was making internet work, I do think empathy was huge, right? I had to practice that. I had to kind of understand how people were feeling or try to feel what they're feeling. And I think it's carried into all of my work, because I am really interested in kind of working very closely, kind of obsessively about people or about, individuals or groups. But more these days, I'm more interested in honing in on like one thing versus the kind of series of like, traveling around. Like that's kind of one of the problems I have with editorial work, is that it's like, go here, shoot this person for 10 minutes. And then it's like the drive-by shooting. Like I get it. I get the practice of it. I get the necessity for it. But I think, the long form kind of working is, you do have to practice that empathy and compassion, right? You have to be aware of people's time. And I think people's time these days is incredibly valuable. And one of the problems I always has is that I feel like I'm wasting people's time, right? Like even my students, I tend to go through things fast because I'm so concerned that they're like bored or not entertained. And I have the same feelings about people that I work with. So I'm always trying to be mindful of their time. And I'm always like surprised when people give me their time, right? Like these men and they're always so calm and patient and kind of reserved. And I like kind of admire that. Like there's this film called Routine Pleasures. It's a French director. But he makes a documentary on these men who run a kind of model train setup in Los Angeles in the 70s and 80s. And they are the calmest group of men I've ever seen. And they just meet once a night and run timescales. And I was blown away because I was like, this guy's doing the same thing I'm doing, 40 years ago with these men. And it's like, it's incredible. So I do think that, you have to be mindful of people and consider them and, empathize with them in order to work closely with them.
Yeah, that is, but I can't help but see it. The care that you're taking in your images, even in the previous one, even in these, the respect that comes through, is very prevalent. It's very evident. And, I've got to applaud you on that, because you can easily jump to conclusions, about pretty much both of these series, even all three. You can go, what are you doing? Waste of time. You know what I mean? But with you, you're not. There's what is the word for it? Dignity. There's a dignity about it. Well, and that is something that I think is missing today. It's I don't know if it's missing, but it's in short supply. I wish you could just sell it at Walgreens or something, I tend to, yeah. What's that?
I think that, on projects like this or trips like this, everything, or even in life, right? Everything is part of the process, right? Like everything you do affects what you do next, I believe, right? Like causality is there, But I think when you're doing something like this, to me, there's potential in almost every experience, right? So you have to be open in order to have any experiences. If you're just like, I'm looking for this and this only, you're never going to see anything or find anything, right? Like my students, so many times I'm like, all right, what do you think of this? And they're like, I don't like this. I'm not looking at this. I'm not going to do this. And I'm like, listen, if you're an artist, to me, that means being receptive to all things, right? But you can't tell someone like, you should like this because you should just like it. But I do think, you have to be open to make anything, right? Like,
yeah, that gospel. There you go. Put that on a t-shirt. Yeah, like that is great. I can't help but see marches. I want to see marches next. Let's take a look at that. And then we'll wrap up pretty quickly right after that. But this is, considering time, we jumped into a workshop with a watchmaker. Is that what?
Clockmaker.
A clockmaker. Okay.
Yeah.
But still, it's fascinating. And so talk to me about this project. How did you evolve into this? Talk to me about how you ended up here.
So, quick story is that I photographed a train derailment in Minnesota while shooting Take Your Time, and I wanted to go back and photograph this train. So I called this gas station. They're like, "Oh, it's been cleaned up." So I was like, "Oh, bummer." So I was like, "Oh, wait, there was a train derailment outside of Lincoln. I'm going to go check it out." I went there. It was cleaned up. I drove to this town called Bennett, and I saw a mural with a freight train in it. So I stopped to photograph it. And when I turned around, I saw this clock in front of this shop. And so I was like, I'm just going to walk in there. And I walked in, and this man comes walking out, and he was very nice. And it was kind of this old, dusty shop. And I was like, started talking to him, and he was telling me about, oh yeah, I've been doing this for 40 years. His name's Greg. Let me say, not Craig, but Greg. It's a block away from the train.
Oh my gosh.
It was kind of this, again, it was like, okay.
Yeah.
He gave me the tour, and it was this wood shop. It's a clock shop and wood shop. It's called ARP Clock and Wood Shop. And it was full of wood, full of dust, full of clocks. And it was, his workshop had 20 clocks going at once. Grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks.
My gosh.
Like, he didn't do watches. He only mainly did grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks, pendulum clocks, quartz clocks, anything like that. And he was kind of renowned. People would come to him from like the kind of multi-state area. And I walked in, he was very nice, and I came back the next day. And then I came back the next day. It was just like photographing Craig, but different, because now I was in a very enclosed space, just in a shop. And I started off by just taking an inventory of everything he had. So I was just kind of, I made these rough pictures of all of his objects, all of his wood scraps, clocks. And I just started coming back. And so I kind of took a multifaceted approach here, but I started with his name, which is ARP, A-R-P. And for the artists out there, you may know Hans Arp and his wife, Sophie Tauber Arp. And they made, abstract work. They were kind of surrealists back in the 20s and 30s. And I used that as my starting point for making work. So I started off kind of making cyanotypes with his kind of wood scraps and just pieces I would find. And I started calling these like reconstructions. And I think of the cyanotype as a time-based process, just like all photograph, but it uses duration to create value. And so I kind
of... Is this like a multiple exposure type thing?
So I took the paper once, and then I moved the objects around over time. So this is it's amazing. Using kind of wood like this.
Yeah.
And then kind of just, I'll expose it in one, I'll let it expose for a few minutes and move it. And I'm thinking about time, thinking about movement, change, difference. But I'm also kind of thinking about the ARPs and about the surrealists and about, okay, I'm recycling his materials in a way that points to the past being recycled in a way, right? To me, art is built on other art, right? Worlds are built on other worlds. Nothing is built from nothing. Everything is built from something. So I'm picking up all these parts, right? And so here are some photograms I built with clock faces that I found in a drawer. And I just did these in darkroom, and I kind of made grids because in the clock shop, to me, the clock shop is an archive of time, right? It holds all time, all memories, and there, it's got everything. So you got the tools, you got, these are family photos, parts, right? Fragments. To me, these reference like train wheels. Did I say that his son is an engineer for BNSF and builds live model steam engines? So he has a train shop. His dad's a clockmaker. They're kind of like one of the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just started kind of playing with all these different parts. And to me, time is a very abstract thing. So I was kind of approaching it through abstraction to start off. And, but at the same time,
people would argue the other direction with that too.
What's that?
That time is finite. It's measurable. It's something that is consistent, but you're looking at it from an abstraction point of view, which is, I think, just as fun.
But I also look at it from the other way too. And so I started to collect everything in there, right? The flies, so spiders, there were many brown recluses in there that I would encounter. And if you don't know what brown recluse is, it's a very poisonous spider.
They're dangerous. Yeah.
They're terrifying. And I learned that they shed, that this is a husk. And I found them all over the shop. But in the way that, right, and I'm rambling because of time, but the clock shop collects time, right? Greg collects time. Spiders collect flies. Cobwebs collect flies. Everything collects dust. It's like this telescoping of collections. So I started taking inventory of kind of everything in there. I would take.
What does he think about all that?
What did he think?
Yeah.
So him and his wife worked there together, and they would say, well, we knew you were eccentric because, I'm making all this stuff. So they gave me a back room. Let's see if I have. Oh yeah. They gave me a space to work when I moved there. I know I have. Sorry, I'm going to hide this for a second so I can find this. They gave me a space to work, and it was very crowded and kind of hectic. I don't know if I can find it. But kind of, this is the shop. I mean, he's got a car in there he's working on because he also fixes cars. So he was kind of he was a person who kept everything on hand, saved everything, much in the same way that I do. And he would just accumulate things. And so I would play with these objects and kind of put them in different ways. So here's, to me, this is like a spiraling big band. It's just sandpaper with a spider web. Here's another photogram. This is his desk, his workshop. But I was trying to find a space that I worked in, which was very small, but it's somewhere buried in here. But yeah, they would kind of laugh at what I was doing, or, they were very encouraging and supportive and welcoming. But I don't think they understood what I was doing for a long time. And I didn't understand what I was doing for a long time either, which kind of it kept it fun. What am I doing here? I'm just kind of making things, doesn't mean anything. So it was this kind of struggle. And I would, I'd come for a week at a time, and then I would kind of maybe disappear for a couple weeks or days, sometimes months. Then I would come back. And it got to a point where they gave me a key because they're like, we're going to go on a cruise. Here's a key. You can come and work. So then I just started coming whenever. So they kind of invited me in, which was a new thing. Right. Like with Craig and the Watcher, it was always like, okay, don't bother this guy, tiptoe around him a little bit. But with them, they were very inviting. So it was a new experience of working, especially work from the internet work, which is anonymously kind of secretive, to now I'm, kind of a part of the shop. He called me his little mouse because I was in the back, and I would take all the stuff and I would make my own collections with them. And he'd be like, where is this thing? And I would have it in the back, but I never touched anything on his desk or anything that he was working on. But some days he would just need stuff from everywhere. But he was an incredibly smart man. Like, he got a master's degree in horticulture. He has a greenhouse where he grows orchids, just down the street. He lives only 2 blocks away with his wife in a house, and he fixes cars, like very old, like 1909 Maxwell. So he was kind of like, he did all these things: woodworking, kind of engineering, metalwork, electrical work, clockwork. So I kind of took that into my practice, where I'm like, okay, how can I diversify what I'm doing to manage all the kind of disparate parts that he's working with. So it was, again, I started to mirror him in his diversity, right? Like, he has to do all these different processes to fix one clock. I have to do all these different processes to kind of make photographs. But I also started to think about, all right, Greg is taking discontinuous time, broken systems, and he has to make it continuous, fix it, make it kind of unified. I'm doing the opposite, right? So there's this dialectic where I'm taking continuous time and making it discontinuous. I'm taking things and breaking them down, right? And making them not function. And so it was that dialectic I found really fascinating in our approach and in our practice, that I think kept things really interesting for us. And I would also go on these kind of tangents. Okay, let's see. There was one day where I looked in a drawer that I hadn't looked in, and I found within the drawer all this kind of ephemera from magazines, and there were clock parts, and there were it's like old popular mechanics from the 80s. It was like this time capsule. And I set out to make a book within 5 days of just what was in the drawer. And it ended up taking 6 months. And it involves cyanotyping, paper, objects. I did gum prints. I scanned things. I photographed things. I kind of abstracted things and made this book that I had to print multiple times with the cyanotypes because it didn't print through the paper. I did zoom ins on pieces of the paper. It's also an accordion fold that folds both ways, that has folds within folds. It's kind of this complex spiral into a drawer, and just a drawer. So it's very, again, kind of banal. Yeah. The books are kind of, we can't look at it here because it's too big.
Yeah, of course.
And then I made another book, like a distilled version of it. So I do a lot of,
it kind of mirrors the disarray of the drawer. You know what I mean? It kind of goes in different directions and opens up, and you find something else and you dig a little deeper. Yeah, that's interesting. You have quite a way of kind of interpreting your world, especially with the photographic medium itself. When I look at kind of your body of work, and I'm seeing the connecting threads as you go through. I can't help but come up with a couple of words for you, which is compassion, dignity, respect, radical openness, exploration. I find a lot of that in these bodies of work. And one thing that is quite interesting to me is this idea of a mirror, and I'm kind of curious if you've always been that way. I'm kind of curious if like this, you almost allow these people to leave reflection on you. Like you kind of, I saw it with Craig. You saw the ritual, so you mimicked the ritual, right? And then you started to world build with the world builders, in that one series. Now here you're kind of diversifying your practice because of that, and I'm noticing that kind of connection. And is that what you're intending to do when you do this stuff, or have you always been that way? I'm kind of curious.
I mean, there's a quote that I like that's, what we look for in each other is each other, right? And I don't think it's ever intentional to set out to be like, okay, I'm going to find a subject, I'm going to mirror the subject and make work on it. It just kind of happens. And I think it comes back to the like empathy and being receptive, right? And I mean, but I also see on the opposite side, it can be sometimes, I think it can be perceived as like an insidious thing where you're like, you mirror someone to get close to them to understand more, right? And I don't think that's my approach, but I do think about that sometimes.
Yeah.
Like it can be a form of alienation in a way where you kind of get too close to something, you kind of start to mirror it, and then it like blurs lines on different things. But I don't think I have any malicious intent, because there's always a conversation with photography.
I don't get that at all.
Yeah.
But I don't get that at all.
The exploitation in photography is always kind of in the background, right? Like, what are you
of course
giving back? And to me, it's, listening, compassion, right? They may not, sometimes I don't, like the ARPs, I haven't given them any work yet because I'm like, well, I'm still working on it. It's like, I show them, I'll bring prints and I'll show them. But one thing I didn't say, so Greg died in April of last year, kind of suddenly and unexpectedly, and which gave a lot of meaning to the work in a way that I had been struggling with. Like, what does this mean? And then when he died, time became this concrete thing, and it became, and then I set out, I documented almost every object in the shop, about 4,000 objects in about a month during a residency. And now I'm kind of building this big book to give to his wife and his kids as like, this is the ARP archive, right? They gave me all their family photos. I've built them into the book. It's now this huge encyclopedia book of the clock shop. And it only took place within the clock shop. It's kind of this huge world that spans decades that I've been working with. And it's really kind of humbling and been a really powerful experience, kind of working with him. And then after he died and continuing to work on it. So I think it's all kind of, I don't know. It's powerful to me.
Well, I think you and I should do a documentary on that. That'd be great. That'd be really, really fun. But I have one last question for you. It's the one I ask everyone. And since you're a teacher, you might actually have a really nice perspective on it. And you kind of alluded to, I think, some really good advice before we actually started diving into the work. But a lot of people that follow this show are either makers themselves or artists, and maybe be up and coming themselves. And so do you have any advice for someone that maybe want to become an artist themselves or join the visual culture itself? Do you have any advice that you would give for any makers out there?
Yeah, it's kind of the same things I tell my student, right? It's like, and it was something it took me a while to learn myself, right? Because when you're trying to break into a market or into a world, I think one of the things you think of is like, how can I make work that is going to get me attraction? And, I took that approach as like, okay, I'm going to make editorial work. I need to make editorial work. And I didn't get much work from it. Like, it didn't mean anything to me. So I never got the work. Once I started doing the kind of But the Eyes Are Blind, that's when I started getting work. So making work that, the cliche is like, make what's true to yourself, what you're actually interested in, right? Don't make work towards the agendas of the photo world or society. Like, make work about whatever you want to make. That's, I think, where meaning is going to come from. You can't, force it. It takes time, right? Like, don't put out a book just to put out a book. Put out a book when it's ready, when it's, when it means something, when it's actually finished, right? Don't get caught up in fast publishing. Don't get caught up in publishing when there's an opportunity to sell, right? Make work to understand the world better, not to benefit off of it. That's why I make work. It's to understand how I interact with the world, right? Like, I'm not interested in selling books or getting, of course I have to get paid and live. And that's why I teach now. So I can make work and I can sit on it for as long as I want. There's no, obligation to finish anything that's, that I'm making on my own agenda. So I think that's what I would say.
I love it. I think that's great advice. And I think it's something that I think a lot of people should hear if they're struggling in this fast-paced world that's always demanding something out of you. And so it's interesting, and I love that perspective. So I just want to say thank you for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed diving into your world, and I hopefully I didn't dig too deep on you, because I really enjoyed the time with you. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I enjoyed sharing it and kind of unpacking some of the things. So I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
It was great. And so, with that being said, how can people find you? Are you on Instagram? And you can also plug your website here if you want to.
Yep. So my Instagram is just my name, @Terry Ratzlaff. My website is Terry A. Ratzlaff. That's my middle initial. I don't really Instagram much these days because I don't find it conducive to an art practice, but I still look at it. And I put stuff on the website. I do have another website called basementwindowbooks.com, which is my small imprint where I make my books. I make giant boxes for my books. And that's kind of where I am. Find me in the real world.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thank you again. And to all those that have made it this far, thank you for joining us today on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, help us with the algorithm and like, share, and comment down below. All of that tells the algorithm, I know we're talking algorithm these days, tells the system that people enjoy this content and they'll share it and get it out to people. That's one way you can support us. The other way you can support us is to join our community on patreon.com. So go to Patreon, join our community there, and help support us that way. And as always, we'll see you next time.